Hi, I'm Grant Robinson, and tonight we're continuing our walk through Kings, and we're looking at chapters 9 through 11. So just to recap the first part of this book so far, we start with the transition from King David to Solomon, and the transition wasn't seamless, but overall it's gone pretty well. So Solomon asks God for wisdom, and God responds by blessing him and making him the wisest person who ever lived, and then also gives him so much more than that. And as great of a king as David was, God says that David wasn't fit to build the temple, but Solomon can, and Solomon builds that temple earlier in Kings. This period is known as the Golden Age of Israel. Yet if you know the Mosaic Law inside and out, you've already seen some cracks starting to form in Solomon's character. To understand this story and how it fits into God's big plan, we have to revisit and understand some of the promises that God has already made prior to Solomon's arrival on the scene. Most recently, we have the covenant between God and David as recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 7. That reads, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." So with what we know so far, it sounds like God could be talking about Solomon because he's done what that side of that promise was. And at the beginning of chapter 9, God appears to Solomon. This is the second time that God has appeared to Solomon in this book so far, and reiterates the promise that he made to David, saying in verse 4, "If you walk before me, as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. As I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you turn aside from me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. And Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples, and this house will become a heap of ruins." Now, the author of Kings doesn't like drawn-out transitions. Right after it goes from the scene with God and David, it goes right back into describing all of the pretty miraculous things that Solomon accomplishes in his career. In chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba comes to visit Solomon and is impressed by his wisdom and the riches of his kingdom. The Queen of Sheba recognizes that Solomon's God is powerful and that Solomon's God is the source of the blessings that she sees. Then chapter 10 concludes with a list of just how wealthy the kingdom was. It says in verse 23, "Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of Shephelah." So it looks like this is it. Like, it can't really get much better. But then we start reading chapter 11, and all of a sudden we see, oh, this is the tipping point. This is where things all start to go wrong. That chapter starts with, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women." And if you had read earlier, you know that these are from the nations which the Lord said the people of Israel were not to marry. So this is Solomon, the wisest person on earth, who wrote the book of Proverbs, which is the book of wisdom, and wrote the Song of Solomon, which is the Bible's love poem. The rest of the story is that Solomon's heart is turned from God and toward his wives as he builds altars for their gods. And God is angry at Solomon, and he says, "I'm going to tear your kingdom away from you, but because of your father, I'm not going to do it while you're alive." And that's just another example of God's grace in the story of Israel. What we see next is a way that God works, which is a way that we don't really think about a whole lot. Normally, when we think about how God works, we think about him showing miraculous signs or helping the characters overcome miraculous odds. But what happens here in chapter 11, verse 9, is not something that we really like to think about. It reads, this is after Solomon turns his heart from God, "And the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite." And then we have other verses following showing how God works through raising up the adversaries of Solomon. So for the first 10 chapters, we've seen the kingdom of Solomon described in its increasing magnificence and splendor. And then in chapter 11, things turn for the worse. Solomon turns from God. God raises adversaries. And then Solomon's kingdom kind of just fizzles out and Solomon dies. So it looks like Solomon fulfills all these promises that God has already made with Israel prior to Solomon coming on the scene. But ultimately what Solomon does is he is just foreshadowing the Messiah who is to come. Solomon's story is a story that the Jewish Pharisees and scribes would have known inside and out. And it's that knowledge that makes Jesus, his words, carry more weight when Jesus says to them in Matthew chapter 12, "The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here." Solomon was in many ways an incredible king, and God blessed him immensely. But Solomon wasn't the fulfillment of God's promises. For the people of Israel, they start to see his kingdom crumble a little bit, and then he dies in chapter 11 and leaves no doubt that he is not the Messiah. But the Davidic covenant is still open and is still looking forward to its fulfillment. And that's something that we're only going to see when we get to the New Testament.